You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, thank you so much for joining us. I am beyond elated to get to this week's guest. But before we get to him, I want to remind you guys to check out all our social media sites. We are on Facebook at Hazard Ground Podcast. Same for Instagram, Hazard Ground Podcast, and on Twitter at Hazard Ground. Those are the places you go. Stay in touch with the show. Let us know what you think, what you like, what you don't like, and we'll certainly appreciate all the feedback. Speaking of feedback, get on iTunes, leave us a rating and a review. That helps us out so much, so we really appreciate it. Now, before we get to this week's guest, I do want to let you know that he is calling from a caption phone. The reason he's calling from a caption phone is because he is 104 years old. Why are we interviewing a 104-year-old man? Because he is the second oldest living survivor of Pearl Harbor left in America. He's now a retired Navy lieutenant, but among the other things that he's done throughout his career, surviving December 7th, 1941 was one of the most notable, if not the most notable. Again, he's 104 years old. He's on a caption phone, but his voice sounds fantastic for his age. It is Jim Downing on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Jim, we are so honored to have you as part of this podcast. And listen, your story is amazing, and we want to hear all about it. But tell us first, how did you end up in the Navy?
I graduated from high school during the center of the Great Depression. I came to a small town, and the only way to get away from a small town and on your own was go in the military. So it was the economy that drove me into the Navy.
When you were looking for a job, was there anything else that piqued your interest other than the military?
Well, I didn't know much about the military, but naturally I was interested. I was patriotic, so I think those two factors are the main ones that drove me in.
Let me ask you, because you talk about the Great Depression, and that was post-World War I. Did the idea of going back to war again ever scare you at that point when you entered into the Navy?
Well, I very carefully considered if I might be involved in war. So I figured if I stayed in the Navy for 20 years, the chances were we would get in a war. So I took that into consideration that part of my career might be going to war.
So how do you ultimately end up at Pearl Harbor?
I enlisted in the Navy in 1932, and in 1933 went aboard the battleship West Virginia. The battleship West Virginia, along with the other battleships, moved from the West Coast to being based in Pearl Harbor in 1940. So that was in Pearl Harbor because that's where the fleet was based.
So when you get to Pearl Harbor, it must seem like paradise. The war in Europe is starting to get underway at this point in time. Did you guys ever think that you were in danger?
We knew that Japan was a threat, but somehow we felt that we were so much stronger than they were, it would be a short war. We were mistaken in what we thought about them as an enemy.
So tell me about that morning of December 7th, 1941. For most of the country, if not all of us, with the exception of you, it's just something we read about in history books, yet you were there. So what can you recall about that morning when you get up?
Yes, as I look back, I can summarize what I went through in 5 words. I'll just mention them. The first was surprise. We had no satellites. We didn't know we were being attacked till we actually saw the airplanes. The second thing was fear. The first airplane I saw up close made a strafing run, and the bullets went over my head. I was afraid the next airplane would be more accurate. Then I was angry that our leadership, political and military, had let us get in that situation. I made a resolve. If I ever got in a position of authority, we would never be caught again, not on the alert. And then finally, it was pride at the way our men responded. In my estimation, everybody was a hero. They looked around to see what needed to be done, and they did it without training, without leadership, and it was a magnificent response that our men did.
So take me back to that moment, if you can, when you see those planes flying overhead. Do you remember what you were thinking and looking up and going, well, that doesn't seem normal?
Yes, the Japanese had painted their planes olive drab like the Army. It was not unusual to see a lot of planes flying around on Sunday morning. So the ones I saw, I thought, well, that's an American plane, not a Japanese plane. I didn't know until the plane that was shooting me banked, and I saw the rising sun painted on the wing. I didn't know it was a Japanese plane.
You talked about the fear. What were other people around you doing? How were they reacting?
Well, my ship, the West Virginia, was hit by 9 aerial torpedoes and began to sink immediately and begin to burn. So we were definitely on the defense. We didn't have the power, electrical power, to activate our guns. So the emphasis was on just saving as many lives as possible.
How do you save lives in that situation when you're trying to save your own?
I would say that just nobody thought about their own lives. At the risk of their own lives, if they could rescue somebody that was drowning, why, they did that. So it was a very selfless effort. And I never saw a coward or a slacker at all that morning.
I understand that morning that you actually were off your battleship because you were a newlywed at the time. Was your wife there with you, and how did you get back on the ship?
There were so many ships in port, actually 164 ships, that they were tied up by twos. We were tied up to the battleship Tennessee. It was practically undamaged. So as I came down to my ship, I got on the Tennessee and slid down the gun barrel, trained out a gun barrel, and slid down the barrel to get on my ship. My wife was not at the harbor. We lived a few minutes away from the harbor. So I didn't see her again until the next morning.
Did she know what had happened? I mean, were people on the island aware of what was going on? Was it that much chaos?
What had happened, we were having breakfast when the attack broke out. We turned on the radio, and the radio announcer said, "We have been advised by Army and Navy intelligence that the island of Oahu is under enemy attack. The enemy has not been identified." But just 2 minutes later, he came back and said, "The enemy has been identified as Japan." So she knew, as the rest of us did, that we're at that house, and all of us grabbed our uniforms and ran down to the harbor.
What was the aftermath like when the attack stopped? I mean, at some point in time, the planes stopped flying overhead and bombs stopped dropping and things of that nature. So how do you collect yourself? What can you recall?
I would say once the bombing was over, that we thought there would be a return attack or maybe an invasion. So immediately all the military began to prepare to repel anybody that tried to land. So the military put their weapons in strategic points. So that was the main concern for all of us then, that can we repel a possible Japanese attack?
Were you able to actually try and mount one?
Yes, machine gun was set up various places on the island, and that was the main thing, was to protect the beaches. There were a lot of undamaged ships that morning. Of the 164 military ships in port, only 22 were seriously damaged. So we had a lot of firepower left.
Do you remember anything crazy that stood out to you, like somebody, I don't know, jumping off a ship, high off a ship into the water to avoid gunfire, or anything out of the ordinary that somebody did just in the heat of the moment to save their life or protect themselves?
Yes, that was the really the saddest part of the morning. That a battleship carries about 1 million gallons of crude oil. So the Arizona, California, West Virginia spilled that oil out. It was so hot that it caught fire, and the flames went out from Battleship Row for maybe 100 yards. So many of the guys who had been blown overboard were underwater. Then when they came up, there was a thin film of oil on them, and they turned into human torches. So that was the saddest thing I saw that morning, was these guys burning to death as they came up in this oil fire.
Wow. I mean, that must have been... What do you do at that point? Because you know you can't save those guys, right?
Yes, because now later, the Navy taught us if you're ever in an oil fire like that, to take your hands up and push it away with your hands so you'll have breathing space when you come up. But we didn't know that then. The guy just came up, as I say, a thin film of oil was on them. We had boats out there trying to rescue them, and those boats, of course, had to protect themselves. So there were boats running right in the middle of the fire, getting as many as they could while protecting themselves at the same time.
Yeah, Jim, obviously it's miraculous that you've been on this earth for 104 years. So when I ask you if you can remember the names of anybody who died that day, and the circumstances, that I understand if you can't, but I'm just curious if you can.
Yes, we lost on our ship 105 during the attack. I was the postmaster on the ship, and later got the death certificates of everybody that was killed to return their mail to where it come from. And among that were about 18 guys that I could call friends, some of them very close friends.
Do you ever look back and wonder how you survived that day?
Yes. Of course, even to this day, I wonder how come God has spared me and let other people go. So I think that some people might call it luck, but I think that God had something in the future for me, and so he protected me.
The crazy part about all this, Jim, is that after he protected you through December 7th, you still had to go into combat because now you were at war in the Pacific. So what happens next? That day ends. The calendar turns over to December 8th. What are you starting to do then?
I kind of live one day at a time. As I look back, I had a job to do December 6th, then I did it. I had a job to do December 7th, I did it. I had a job to do December 8th, and I did it. So just living one day at a time. So being the postmaster, we had a lot of mail to return to their parents. And then it was near Christmas, and a lot of the guys that survived went on different ships. So my job was to get their mail to them. So that was what I did. We were always alert to the fact there might be another attack. We didn't have any satellites, but immediately we started, damage control effort. Clean up, get ready for what comes next.
You mentioned the anger before at, the politicians and your military leaders for not knowing that an attack was coming. Did you have an anger to want to go get back, like to go after the Japanese and get back at them for what they did to you guys?
I think that I'm among the average American young men that we start out playing games, and the objective is always to defeat the enemy. So that's in our blood. So immediately, that's what come to mind. That was what we resolved to do, is to engage the enemy and win. I've been asked many times that ever have the thought that we might lose the war, and that thought never entered my mind that we would lose. We would engage them and win.
Jim, you've told people that the greatest peace you've ever had in your life was during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Why is that, and where did you find that peace?
Well, what happened that there was a gasoline tanker in port. It decided to change to another berth. The Japanese had sent in 75 fighters. They had machine guns and light bombs. And when they saw this tanker, they thought it was full and attacked it like swarms of bees. I was about 400 yards from it. And every time they made an attack, I thought they would hit a vulnerable point, and I know what a quarter gasoline will do. So if several hundred gallons go up, I expect to be wiped out. So my conversation with God during that time was, I'll be with you in a minute. And a minute passed, and next minute, well, I'll be with this minute. But all that time, I had this deep peace that if I did get hit, I knew where I was going to end up. And I think I was probably a little bit disappointed when I was still alive after these attacks were over.
Disappointed? Why?
Well, I was already had a taste of heaven. I thought I'd be there in a minute. And there's great anticipation of what eternity was going to be like. I didn't want to leave my family, but at that point, I didn't have any choice.
That's a beautiful sentiment. I mean, I smile and I laugh because anecdotally, it's funny the way you tell the story. But I mean, a lot of us in combat, whether it was in your era or mine, I think experienced that peace at some point in time, knowing that you've come to grips with your own mortality. And that's something that's not easy for anybody to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So tell me about your career after Pearl Harbor. Where do you go next?
The ship was salvageable, so we immediately started a salvage operation. Pearl Harbor is a shallow harbor. We only had about 6 feet of water under us. So we sunk in the mud. Everything above the water line burned. But it took a year and a half to salvage the ship. After we got that done, I got orders to the new battleship, the South Dakota. In order to go aboard, I had to go to school to get up on the latest weapons. When I graduated from the school in Washington, D.C., they needed one more instructor. So they pulled me out of the classroom, and I became an instructor. I rode out the war in Washington, D.C. in school.
And so after you finish school and you get back aboard another ship, where are you going and what are you doing?
The South Dakota was the new battleship. But as I say, they canceled my orders to be a teacher. And so I never got any more combat during World War II.
But you did get in combat during Korea, correct?
Yes, I was the captain of a aviation supply ship operating out between Korea and Japan during the Korean War. Actually, my ship was meant to transport supplies, but I had a drone unit on it, about 20 drone planes. And so every ship that passed between Japan and Korea had to shoot at our drones. So my part in the Korean War was sitting out on the bomb line and meeting every UN ship that come across to target practice on our drones.
The Korean War is interesting to me because in the grand scheme of things, it seems like the forgotten war. Like no one ever talks about it. There's World War I, World War II, and then we go right to Vietnam and into the present day, modern battles that we fight. What stands out to you about the Korean War?
I'm thinking back now about the state of the world. I believe that the way history will judge a president is how did he use the resources of his nation to combat the greatest danger that faced the world. So when Truman was president, the biggest danger to the world was the spread of communism. So the president used his resources to stop the spread and was successful in setting up the UN and the Korean War and other things to start the advance of communism. So as I look at it, I think it was a just war to prevent the spread of communism further.
After the Korean War, your military career ends shortly thereafter, correct?
Yes. The North Vietnamese communists were not allowed to take over all of Korea. So I would say it was successful.
Why did you ultimately decide to get out of the Navy?
I had 24 years service, and I developed bronchial asthma. So I had to leave the service with a physical disability. I think if that I hadn't gotten that disability, I'd have probably stayed in the service as long as they'd let me, because I enjoyed my career. However, I had waiting for me a job in a Christian organization, the Navigators, and I knew I was going to go from one enjoyable career to an even more enjoyed career. So since I got out of the Navy right up to today, I have been a part of this organization, the Navigators, which has a worldwide Christian ministry.
When you got the chance to go back to Pearl Harbor for the first time after your military career was over, what was that like for you?
I started going back pretty soon after the war, and the evidence of the attack was diminishing all the time. I've been there many times. In fact, the ship I was in command of was stationed there for 3 years. I've been there for the last 2 reunions and celebrations of anniversaries. I was there for both the 74th and 75th. When I first started going to Hawaii, there was a certain degree of primitive to it. It was the jet age that made Hawaii come alive. Before that, there were only 1 or 2 ships a week that came in. So it was a real paradise. But today, the traffic is as bad as it is in Times Square, and it's not an isolated little island anymore.
Does that bother you?
Well, I haven't visited the other islands, but I hope some of them are maintained in that condition, because it's a wonderful part of the world to live in.
Are you happy that so many people go to see those monuments or those sunken ships and go to Pearl Harbor to learn about the history? Does that make you proud that people are still willing to do that this many years later?
Yes. I talk about Pearl Harbor in schools and universities and service clubs, spend a lot of time on the road. And every time I ask how many have been to Pearl Harbor, and I'm amazed at the number of people that visit Pearl Harbor. In fact, one of the people who lived there, a friend of mine, said there's a 40,000 turnover daily. 40,000 leave, 40,000 more come in. So it's a busy spot, all right.
You know, Jim, so much has happened since you left the military and obviously Pearl Harbor. When you see the world and how it's progressed through Vietnam into the Gulf War, and then you see all the war on terror and everything, does one event ever stick in your mind more than another, or does any event compare to what you went through on December 7th?
I'll kind of approach that around the perimeter that I'm often asked, have I forgiven the Japanese and the Germans? Now, it is my observation, having traveled most of the world, that it's natural for people of different nationalities and races to love each other. They're curious about each other. They want to learn. They want to help. But their minds are poisoned by some ambitious dictator or government. So it's the leaders that I find it hard to forgive. So it seems like there's not a generation that we don't have some leaders or government that want to impose their will on the rest of the government. So I'd like to see an age when that is not true. But I listened to the confirmation hearings in the Senate of the president, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was asked, what is the most danger? What's the greatest threat? And on the open hearing in the Senate, he gave the three nations that were the greatest threat. So we've never been without some ambitious person that didn't want to impose his will on the rest of the country.
Everybody of this generation has 9/11 burned into their minds the way people of your generation had Pearl Harbor burned into their minds. You lived them both. Do they compare in any way to you?
I feel the only comparison is the number of people, the casualties. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the future of our country was in jeopardy. But 9/11 was a very local thing. We're sorry about the number of people killed, but it did not cause any threat to our nation or our security.
Do you think that people view the military differently today than they did when you were in?
I keep hearing the figure that only 1% of the population of the United States has ever served or ever will serve. And so I really resent it when I see the military badly treated. But today, there's a thankful generation, more than there's been for 75 years. The generation today has grandparents, maybe they were involved in the war. They're thankful for their freedom. They look around for somebody to thank, and they find the veterans. So I would say the veterans are enjoying the greatest affirmation and help that they've ever been in history. So I'm proud of the way that the country is treating veterans today, including me.
Is it weird to you that, World War II veterans, the few that are left like yourself, today get the highest respect in the world, but yet, the 50,000 Americans who died in World War II, it's almost like you guys didn't get that sort of adoration after World War II was over. Is that surprising to you?
I would say it did, but it was a pleasant surprise.
Jim, what do you tell people when you go around the country talking? What do you tell people about your life and your service now? Like, how do you put a bow on 104 years?
I try to, I want to leave a heritage to the people I speak to. And I quote Ronald Reagan in a speech he delivered in the late 1900s. The speech was called Peace Through Strength. He coined this phrase, weakness invites aggression. The Pearl Harbor Survivor's motto is, remember Pearl Harbor, keep America alert. I add to that, keep America alert and strong. I saw a no parking sign the other day that said, don't even think about parking here. I feel that we must keep America so strong in cyberspace, in the skies, on the water, under the water, and on the ground, so strong that no enemy will even think about attacking us. So that's the message I want to leave behind.
Well, Jim, look, I've only spent 18 years in the military, and I don't even know how to thank you. I mean, my time in combat feels nothing close to what you had to go through. And from one, soldier to a sailor, I have nothing but the greatest adoration and respect for you. And I sincerely thank you for the life that you've led and the dedication to your country, and just being able to survive December 7th, 1941. In and of itself is something that is just unreal, but to continue to live on the way you have, it's an inspiration to us all.
Well, it's been very pleasant to visit with you. And you as a veteran are a hero, as well as all the rest of the veterans. Our exposure at Pearl Harbor was about 3 hours. Today, we've got heroes that are exposed to that much every morning and every afternoon. So in my mind, everybody's a hero.
Well, Jim, I wish you nothing but the best in life, and here's to 104 more for you. God bless you, and thank you so very much.
Well, thank you much for talking with me.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell, and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.